In the middle of the 15th century, the lower Danube marked more than a border. It marked a fault line. On one side stood the expanding authority of the Ottoman Empire, an institution built on administration, taxation, and military order. On the other stood Wallachia, a narrow principality whose survival depended not on numbers, but on control. Vlad III of Wallachia ruled from that narrow space. He inherited a land pressed from both sides, Hungarian interests to the west, Ottoman power to the south. Wallachia was not a kingdom of wealth or armies, it was a corridor. Armies passed through it. Taxes were extracted from it. Sons of its rulers were taken from it. Vlad himself had once been such a son. As a boy, he was sent to the Ottoman court as a political guarantee. There, he learned the language of empire, not only words but systems. He observed how authority was maintained through hierarchy, record-keeping, and consequence. Punishment was not random. It was procedural. When Vlad returned to Wallachia and eventually claimed power, he did not attempt to imitate the Ottoman system. He inverted it. The Ottomans governed through absorption. Vlad governed through separation. By the early 1460s, the relationship between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire had fractured. Tribute was delayed. Messengers returned unanswered. Garrisons stationed south of the Danube began to disappear, not in battle but in silence. Ottoman patrols sent north encountered villages emptied of sound. Roads were intact. Fields were still. Nothing was burned, nothing looted. The absence itself became the message. Captured Ottoman soldiers were not treated as bargaining assets. They were removed from circulation. No ransoms were negotiated. No formal exchanges recorded. Reports reaching Ottoman administrators spoke instead of measures enacted by the Wallachian ruler, measures that did not conform to expected warfare. Vlad did not meet the Ottomans on open ground. He targeted infrastructure. Supply columns vanished. River crossings were rendered unusable without visible destruction. Prisoners taken during these encounters were not paraded or publicly interrogated. They were processed, documented, separated, and transferred inland. What happened after that was not immediately known. The Ottoman Empire was accustomed to cruelty in war. It was not accustomed to unpredictability. As weeks passed, rumors began to replace reports. These rumors did not describe chaos. They described order, too much order. Ottoman scouts spoke of carefully arranged sites encountered beyond the frontier, not battlefields, not camps, spaces that appeared organized, deliberate, and intentionally visible. No accounts described the acts themselves. Instead, they described the aftermath: alignment, repetition, scale. Ottoman officers struggled to classify what they were seeing. There were no banners, no proclamations, no demands issued to the Sultan. Vlad was not communicating diplomatically. He was communicating structurally. Within Wallachia, Vlad's authority hardened. Local nobles who resisted found themselves removed with the same efficiency as foreign captives. There were no trials in the modern sense. There was an older logic at work, one rooted in deterrence and permanence. Fear was not a byproduct, it was the mechanism. Vlad's court did not deny the treatment of prisoners. It did not elaborate on it either. Foreign envoys received short answers. Prisoners of war, they were told, had been dealt with according to law. No law was specified. The Ottomans began to understand that the threat was not the loss of men. Empires could absorb losses. The threat was the erosion of expectation. Ottoman military doctrine relied on predictability: advance, resistance, negotiation, consolidation. Vlad removed the negotiation phase entirely. Prisoners did not return. Messages did not come back altered or delayed. They ended. This had a psychological effect far beyond Wallachia's size. Ottoman commanders hesitated before crossing north. Soldiers spoke among themselves. The Danube, once a logistical boundary, became a mental one. Chroniclers within the Ottoman world struggled with how to record these events. Excessive detail risked spreading fear. Too little risked underestimating the danger. As a result, many records became abstract, numbers without narrative, outcomes without method. European observers farther removed filled the gaps with speculation. But inside Wallachia, there was no speculation. There was only compliance. Vlad ruled through visibility without spectacle. He did not appear constantly in public. He allowed the consequences of disobedience to stand in his place. Authority in his system was something encountered, not announced. Ottoman prisoners once taken ceased to exist as individuals. They became components in a broader demonstration aimed not at revenge but at control. This distinction mattered. Vlad was not attempting to defeat the Ottoman Empire militarily. That was impossible. He was attempting to make Wallachia ungovernable by anyone but himself. The Ottoman response was delayed, not because of indecision, but because of disbelief. Empires expect resistance. They do not expect a ruler to weaponize reputation so thoroughly that the movement of troops itself becomes uncertain. By the time Ottoman leadership fully acknowledged the nature of Vlad's strategy, the psychological damage had already been done. Soldiers entering Wallachia were no longer thinking in terms of victory. They were thinking in terms of survival, and Vlad knew this. He did not escalate publicly. He did not need to. The system was already in motion. Prisoners continued to be taken. Information continued to stop at Wallachia's borders. What lay beyond those borders was no longer simply hostile territory. It was an environment designed to unsettle, and the Ottomans had not yet seen the full structure behind it. The Ottoman response to Wallachia's resistance began, as all imperial responses did, with records. Numbers were gathered, routes were mapped again, losses were categorized by time and location. What the administrators found was not encouraging. Patrols were not being intercepted randomly. They were being intercepted where they mattered most, at crossings, supply points, and communication lines. This suggested planning. Vlad's actions were no longer interpreted as impulsive cruelty. They were recognized as part of a deliberate system of control. Ottoman prisoners taken during these encounters were processed with an efficiency that unsettled those who survived long enough to report fragments of it. They were separated by rank. Officers disappeared first, then specialists, engineers, quartermasters, scribes. Ordinary soldiers followed. This sequence was noted. Within Wallachia, these captives were moved inland, away from borders and towns frequented by foreign traders. The locations were not fortresses in the traditional sense. They were administrative spaces, repurposed estates, abandoned religious buildings, and isolated compounds whose original functions had been erased. Nothing in these places suggested chaos. There were routines, there was supervision, there were records kept by Vlad's own official, though few of those documents survive intact. The purpose was not interrogation. The purpose was example. Vlad understood that empires function on information flow. His method targeted that flow directly. Prisoners were not used to extract intelligence. They were removed so completely that intelligence itself collapsed. Ottoman commanders noticed another pattern. Prisoners were not exchanged even when such exchanges were offered. Diplomatic envoys sent to negotiate returns were dismissed or delayed indefinitely. The Wallachian court maintained formal courtesy while offering nothing substantive. This forced the Ottomans into an unfamiliar position. Every soldier sent north now carried an unspoken understanding: capture meant erasure. As this awareness spread, discipline began to degrade before battles even occurred. Marches slowed. Scouts refused to advance beyond certain markers. Supply lines required heavier guards, further reducing offensive strength. Vlad had achieved something rare. He had made fear logistical. At the same time, he tightened internal control. Wallachian nobles who questioned his policies were subjected to the same system applied to foreign prisoners. Rank offered no protection. Familiarity offered no exemption. By applying identical measures internally and externally, Vlad eliminated the distinction between traitor and enemy. All resistance was processed the same way. Ottoman intelligence reports from this period become increasingly cautious in tone. Words like unusual, severe, and unnamed practices appear more frequently. Specific descriptions vanish. This absence was intentional. The Ottoman state understood that graphic detail would weaken morale. Silence became a containment strategy. Information was restricted to senior command. Even there, discussions avoided method, focusing instead on outcome. The outcome was clear. Wallachia could not be pacified quickly. When Sultan Mehmed II prepared his campaign against Vlad, he did so with overwhelming force, not to defeat an army, but to neutralize a system. The objective was no longer conquest. It was removal. As Ottoman forces advanced into Wallachia, they encountered landscapes that appeared deliberately arranged. Roads led through areas that offered visibility but no safety. Villages were positioned to provide shelter but no supplies. Everything functioned but nothing supported occupation. Then came the sights. Ottoman chroniclers describe them indirectly: fields beyond settlements, visible from a distance, arranged with a precision that suggested administration rather than fury. These were not hidden. They were placed where advancing forces would have to acknowledge them. The effect was immediate. Veteran soldiers hesitated. Officers struggled to maintain formation. The presence of these sites disrupted command structure without a single engagement. Vlad did not appear to confront the invading army directly. He remained distant, allowing the system he had built to operate independently of his physical presence. This was critical. Authority did not require visibility. It required inevitability. Even when Ottoman forces pushed deeper, they found no centralized command to dismantle. There was no single location to capture that would end resistance. The structure was distributed, decentralized, and maintained by fear rather than orders. For the Ottomans, this represented a new kind of enemy. Not a rival empire, not a rebellious vassal, but a ruler who had transformed terror into governance. The campaign eventually forced Vlad from power. Empires, when sufficiently motivated, always prevail in the long term, but the cost was disproportionate. Resources were drained, time was lost, morale was damaged in ways that could not be easily repaired. Ottoman records following the campaign show a notable shift. Future references to Wallachia emphasize caution. Garrisons were reinforced. Commanders with experience in the region were preferred. The territory had acquired a reputation that outlasted Vlad himself. This reputation was not based on myth. It was based on memory. And memory, once established within an institution, does not fade quickly. Even after Vlad's removal, Ottoman administrators noted that the patterns he introduced lingered. Local resistance did not immediately collapse. Compliance remained brittle. Control required constant reinforcement. The system Vlad created had outlived him, and that, more than any single act, alarmed the empire. When Vlad III disappeared from power, There was no formal closing of accounts. No declaration ended his rule. No proclamation summarized his methods. Authority in Wallachia shifted hands quietly under the pressure of external force and internal exhaustion. To the Ottoman Empire, the immediate objective had been achieved. The system Vlad built no longer operated with the same coherence, but the effects did not vanish. Ottoman administrators returning to border governance encountered a region that no longer responded predictably to imperial logic. Tribute was extracted, but reluctantly. Garrisons were installed, but heavily. Roads reopened, yet patrols moved cautiously, as if expecting resistance that never fully materialized. What Vlad had constructed was not an institution that could be inherited. It was a precedent. Within Ottoman records from the late 15th century, Wallachia appears less frequently as a target of expansion and more often as a problem of containment. Language shifts. The territory is described not as rebellious but as unstable, not hostile but difficult. These are the terms empires use when force has proven insufficient to erase memory. The fate of the Ottoman prisoners taken during Vlad's rule was never formally resolved. No lists of returns exist. No mass exchanges recorded. In official documents, these men simply stop appearing. They are not marked as executed. They are not marked as released. They are marked as absent. This absence created an administrative discomfort. Empires depend on closure. Losses are meant to be accounted for, even if only symbolically. Vlad denied that closure, leaving a gap in the imperial record that could not be reconciled. Within Wallachia, local chronicles took a different approach. They did not dwell on methods. They focused instead on outcomes, stability, order, and the elimination of internal dissent. Vlad was remembered not as a sadist, but as a ruler who made disobedience impossible. This dual memory, terror to outsiders, discipline to insiders, ensured that his legacy would fragment along political lines. European observers, writing from a distance, filled the silence with interpretation. Pamphlets circulated decades later, emphasizing cruelty while ignoring context. These accounts were not concerned with governance or strategy. They were moral warnings, shaped by fear rather than analysis. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, did not mythologize Vlad. It archived him. In Ottoman historiography, Vlad appears as an anomaly, an example of how excessive deterrence could destabilize an entire frontier. His name becomes a reference point, invoked when discussing the limits of imperial absorption. This is significant. Empires rarely acknowledge individuals who expose structural vulnerability. When they do, it is usually in restrained language, embedded deep within administrative texts. Over time, the physical sites associated with Vlad's methods decayed. Fields were reclaimed, structures repurposed. Nothing official marked what had occurred. Silence, once again, became the preferred state. Yet the absence remained instructive. Later rulers in the region avoided repeating his approach, not because it was ineffective, but because it was unsustainable. Vlad's system required constant personal oversight and a willingness to accept universal fear, including fear directed inward. Such governance cannot endure beyond the individual who enforces it. And yet, the Ottoman Empire never fully dismissed the lesson. Military manuals from later centuries emphasize the danger of commanders who remove negotiation from warfare. Intelligence protocols were adjusted. Psychological factors were increasingly considered alongside logistical ones. Vlad's impact did not alter the empire's trajectory, but it altered its caution. For Wallachia, His rule became a benchmark. Later leaders invoked his name selectively, never in detail, always in implication. He became a shadow reference, a reminder of what had once been done when survival outweighed restraint. No monuments were raised to the prisoners who vanished under his system. No official reckoning occurred. Their fate was absorbed into the larger narrative of frontier warfare, stripped of individuality and reduced to consequence. This, too, was part of the legacy. The story of Vlad the Impaler is often told as spectacle. But within the historical record, what endures is not spectacle but structure. A ruler who understood that fear, when systematized, could substitute for force. The Ottoman Empire survived him, but it never forgot the environment he created. And in the margins of imperial memory, that environment remained, a reminder that control is not always achieved through conquest. Sometimes it is achieved through the careful management of absence.